Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at bist, doch, o Seele, so betrübet, which translates to what are you, O soul, so sad. Fairly straightforward chorale. A couple of interesting moments here and there, but really not much to write home about. So we're just going to hop right into the analysis and just work our way through the chorale. No key signature. We start with A minor. We end with A major. I reckon the overall tonality of this chorale is A minor. Passing tone here in the tenor before we get another A minor chord. A, E, A, and C. No need to reanalyze. Then we get E, E, G sharp, and C. I do think this C is like a 6/5 suspension over the bass, so I reckon that this chord is a 5 chord. However, I guess you could technically analyze this as a 3 augmented chord depending on how you hear it. We also have a little delayed passing 7th here, so maybe you could analyze this as a 5/7 chord because it's like really the 7th and the 5th of the chord are like a 16th note apart. You could lump the 5 into the greater context of the whole chord that's happening over the beat. We then get A minor, A, C, E, and A, and then we get another A minor chord just like the beginning. A, C, A, and E. No need to reanalyze. We then have D, B, A, and F. B minor 7 flat 5 over D. We know that Bach loves 2/6/5 chords, especially in cadential situations, and this is a cadential progression for sure, but the phrase is extended, and it's actually quite a long phrase proportionate to the entirety of the chorale. It's 3 measures long. So we would expect a 5 chord after this, which we get E, B, G sharp, and E. It's our 5 chord. Passing 7th in the melody, and then we get A minor, A, E, and C. Very typical progression in Bach. C is a chord tone, so we don't have to mark it. And then we get ready for a half cadence here at the end of the chorale. More specifically, it is a Phrygian half cadence. And we get a bit of an ambiguous chord here. We have F, B, A, and D. So on one hand, this could be analyzed as a 2/4/3 chord. I think that's a perfectly valid analysis. But I think this is actually a 4/6 chord, and that this A is actually the 5th of the chord rather than this B being the root of the chord. And I talked about my logic, I think, in yesterday's chorale as well, because usually in Bach's Phrygian half cadences, you have one of 2 scenarios. You either have a contrapuntal situation like this one, where the chord is interpretable in a couple of different ways. We can see a 4/6 chord, we can see a 2/4/3 chord a lot, we can see a 6/7 chord sometimes. It's just that this F is in the bass. That's what makes this a Phrygian half cadence. But usually there's a counterpoint going on in the supporting voices that makes the chord not entirely straightforward. The other situation that we see, it's usually just a straightforward, just no counterpoint 4/6 chord. So that makes me lean more towards the side of these chords being implied 4/6 chords, because in the situations where there aren't counterpoint, they are 4/6 chords usually without debate. So if the 4/6 chord is extrapolatable from the texture, that's what I tend to side with in terms of my analysis. I do think there were a handful of Phrygian half cadences though that do have 6 chords in there. Apologies for the sirens on the back. I hope everything's okay. And then of course, this being a half cadence, we end on a 5 chord. E, B, G sharp, and E, and that same chord gets repeated again, so we don't need to reanalyze. Moving on to these 2 short phrases in the B section, we have an imperfect authentic cadence here in the key of C major. We start off with A minor, A, E, A, and C, which is our tonic triad in the key of A minor. It's also our 6 chord in the key of C major. We then get B, D, G, and D, which is our 5 chord, G major in first inversion. And then we have a bit of an interesting chord here. We have B, D, F, and D. And similar to the beginning of the chorale, I do think this is sort of operating as like a 6/5, almost like a 6/5 suspension. I know it's not the same because it's not resolving stepwise, but I do think the D. It's not really turning into a non-chord tone, is it? Because it is a part of the chord coincidentally. So I guess technically speaking, you could analyze this as a B diminished chord in root position, but I don't think that that's what's happening here. I think what's happening is the G is going down to F here in the alto, and it is, from a literal interpretation standpoint, kind of confusing things. But I think the big picture is that we're just adding the 7th and keeping the chord in first inversion. So I'm just going to change the figured bass. And then we have a 4-3 suspension here in the alto for our cadence. It's usually more common to see 9/8 suspensions over our tonic triad, but usually in a cadential situation, it's much more common to see a 4-3 suspension, even though 4-3 suspensions in the middle of the phrase are usually saved for 5 chords in root position. C, C, E, and G. Perhaps Bach is foreshadowing what C major is going to be in the next phrase, which is the 5 chord, because we are moving to the key of F, and we're getting somewhat of a similar phrase type in terms of the way the harmony operates and the overall form of the phrase. It's an imperfect authentic cadence where the 5th of the melody is, or sorry, the 5th of the chord is in the melody, and we get a similar progression as well. So we start the phrase off with G major, B, D, G, and D. It's in first inversion, and that takes us to C major, C, C, G, and E. This is our tonic triad, and this starts a bit of a modulation zone. You could say that the modulation happens here, you could say that the modulation happens here as well. I'm going to say it happens later because that's where we hear the B flat, which is indicative of the fact that we are moving to the key of F. We have E, C, G, and C, which is just taking our tonic triad and inverting it, but in the key of F, it is our 5 chord in first inversion, and similar to what's happening in this phrase here, except for it's spread out over 2 beats, we have B flat in passing. We also have this anticipatory, that sounds right, an anticipatory C, and that takes us to C7 over E, which sort of validates, or not necessarily validates, but reinforces the analysis I did here, because if these phrases are similar in terms of their structure, probably this 7-6-5 chord is also kind of like what's happening in the phrase before it, because they're likened to one another. Not identical by any means, but likened. And similar to the previous phrase, we end with our tonic triad, F, A, F, and C. Now moving on to the next phrase, we have a bit of an interesting situation here. I think you could make the argument that there is a direct modulation to the key of A minor here, and we just start things off with this A major chord, or sorry, C sharp diminished chord. But I don't think there's anything inherently more A minor like about C sharp diminished than F major like, because they're both secondary dominants that work in both keys. In this case, I'm just going to say that we're still in the key of F major for all intents and purposes. I mean, in the melody, we do have E going to F, which sounds like 7 going to 1. So this C sharp diminished chord, E, C sharp, G, and E, would be 7/6 of 6 in the key of F. And then we get 6, like we would expect, D, D, F, and F. And it's 2 roots and 2/3, but we do get A here in the alto as well. So we do get our 6th chord that I do think turns into 4 in the key of A minor. And the reason why I think this is where we go to E minor is because we have G sharp on the next beat. And then we have an interesting sort of situation that we could extrapolate multiple chords from. We have E, D, G sharp, and E. And where I do think this is a 5/7 chord, this is sort of like one of those interesting, maybe false 7/6 suspensions that we see. If you look at this D as a 7/6 suspension over the bass, this would be an augmented triad in first inversion, which we have seen before, also in the same point of the measure, metrically speaking, and also debated with a potentially 5/7 chord. So I think that that's kind of interesting, or maybe it's just a coincidence, I don't know. But all in all, this feels like a 5/7 chord to me. Sometimes the suspension does sound like the chord tone, and I think Bach does that on purpose. But moving on to the next phrase, we have another debatable chord. The counterpoint creates a point of comparison or contrast, I guess, between two chords that could be analyzed. We have F, C, A, and D, which does lead to the chord that I think is being analyzed here, which is a D minor 7 chord over F, which would be 4, 6, 5. Typically a less common chord than what we would potentially also analyze it as. F, B, D, and D, which is B diminished over F, which would be a 2, 6, 4 chord. Maybe equally uncommon chords in terms of Bach's harmonic procedures, but the reason why I feel like this is a 4, 6, 5 chord rather than a 2, 6, 4 chord is pretty minute. This here kind of looks like a 5, 4 suspension, which traditionally doesn't, not typically something that you see, especially because it would be an augmented fourth here between the bass and the tenor. But I think really this is just Bach creating a syncopation that crosses the bar line, right? This is a quarter note, this is a quarter note, and then effectively this could be a quarter note too. Why it's not tied, I think, is just based on interpretation. You'll see ties and suspensions notated differently depending on the version of the score you look at, but they all more or less imply the same thing. But basically the tenor line is shifted over a half beat to the right. So either way, this is some type of predominant chord that is getting us ready for this downward scalar progression we have here in the bass, or downward scalar line, excuse me. We have E, A, E, and C. It's actually really interesting. We have another sort of one of these 5/4 suspensions here, but the chord tone feels like it's on the and of the beat. So maybe this is a situation where this is the actual chord. But what's happening here is Bach is like oscillating between chords that are in inversion in ways that we typically don't see them because of the long scalar line, which I think is super cool. But afterwards we get D, G sharp, F, and B. I think this A is like a 7/6 suspension over the bass. It's difficult to say. In this case, it's actually not as difficult. In these earlier situations, I think it's a little bit more nebulous or flexible because the chords don't have as strong of a narrative implication, but here it does. This looks definitely like a G sharp diminished chord, fully diminished 7th in second inversion. That would be 7/4/3, and then we would expect that to go to our tonic, which it does. C, A, E, and A. I think this B is a 7/6 suspension here in the melody, and that would make this G an accented non-chord tone as well. And this progression is actually really interesting because a pattern that we see a lot in Bach, which we're going to see in the next two beats, is taking two similar chords that are separated by an inversion and then using a chord that is a chord that is a diatonic step below in inversion to bridge the gap. So typically we see this with 1 and 7/6 with a 7/6 in between them, but here we see 1/6 and 1/6/4 with a 7/4/3 or a 7/6/4 chord in between them, which I think is pretty cool. But I think you could also analyze this chord depending on if you look at this B as a chord tone as a C major 7 chord, or in other words a 3/7 chord. So after our 1/6 or 3/7 chord here, we move into that progression that I was talking about just before. We have B, B, D, and G sharp. This E could potentially lead us to analyze this chord differently. I do think this is G sharp diminished in first inversion, but you could analyze it as E7 over B, which would be a 5/4/3 chord as well. But yeah, 7/6 just makes more sense in terms of how Bach typically contextualizes this progression. Like I said, 1/6, 7/6, going to 1, A, E, A, and C, this D being an accented non-chord tone. So yeah, this version of the progression, 1/6, 7/6, 1, is the usual version, but here we see that Bach is using a similar way to bridge the 1/6/4 and the 1 chord in passing, but he uses another inversion to do so. So I think that's super interesting, and he also adds the 7th in there as well. So moving on to our final cadence, the phrase ends in a perfect authentic cadence like we would expect, and it uses the major chord like we would expect as well. We have E, E, A, and B. I reckon this A is a 4-3 suspension over the bass, and a 5 chords being implied, E major. Then we get the resolution on the next beat, E, E, G sharp, and B, with the passing 7th in the tenor. No need to reanalyze because it's really just being implied on the previous beat. And then we get A major, A, C sharp, A, C sharp, E, and A, which is of course our tonic triad and root position. So not really too much to write home about here. I think really the interesting takeaway for me is the progression right here of 1-6-7 in second inversion and 1-6-4, which sort of I've seen Bach do similar progressions like this in the past, but it's always interesting because this relationship of taking two chords that are separated by an inversion and bridging it with a chord that's a step below seems to be very commonplace for Bach, and I would venture that even the majority of his chorales have a progression like this within them, if not the majority, close to the majority, and it definitely seems like something that's close to a universal convention for Bach, one of his sort of bread and butter progressions. But yeah, some interesting chord voicings in this chorale. This section here where he just works his way down the scale from the 6th all the way down to the 1. It's pretty interesting. And I think that's really all I wanted to talk about in today's chorale. This one was a short one, so yeah, like I mentioned at the beginning, not too much to write home about. And I think I'm going to cap the video off on those thoughts. So if you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You can hit the notification icon and like the video if you enjoyed the content as well. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.